Wyoming Territory, late September, 1879. The wind was sharp that morning, pulling cold through the cottonwoods and across the dry earth as Nathaniel Hart stepped into his barn with a bucket in hand and found a stranger crouched by the nesting boxes. She gasped. Her hand shot behind her, trying to hide the eggs she had just gathered into the folds of her threadbare shawl. She looked up at him like a deer cornered between two trees, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked from the cold. "Do not move," Nathaniel said, voice low, steady. His hand hovered near the revolver on his hip, not drawn, not yet. He had seen men sneak onto his land before, but this was a woman. And she was shaking. "I am not here to take anything else," she whispered, breath visible in the air. "Just the eggs. I will leave. You already took something." "I needed them," she said, standing slowly. Her legs trembled under the worn hem of her dress. "My baby, he has not eaten in 2 days." Nathaniel stared at her. She could not have been more than 20. No rings on her hands, no shoes on her feet, just layers of weathered skirts and a coat at least 2 winters too old. "You have a child?" he asked, not lowering his hand. "Yes." Her voice cracked. "Please, I do not want trouble." He exhaled through his nose, glancing past her at the 3 broken eggshells on the ground. She had eaten some already. That was not thieving. That was starving. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Adeline. Adeline Dawson." "And your baby?" "Zeke," she said, tears starting to gather in her lashes. "He is just over 1. Please, I will go. Just let me keep what I have." Nathaniel lowered his hand from the revolver. "Where is he?" Adeline looked toward the edge of the woods. "A mile east. There is a shack. It is all we have." He stepped closer now, slow. She did not back away, just clutched her shawl tighter around the stolen eggs. Her face was flushed from effort, and when she lifted her chin, he saw pride there, even through the desperation. "You walked here with no shoes, carrying nothing but hope you would find a few eggs?" he asked. She swallowed. "Yes." Nathaniel nodded once. "Come on. We are getting your baby." She blinked. "What?" "You should not have to choose between stealing and letting your child starve," he said. "I have a wagon. We will bring him back." Adeline stood frozen for a long second as if she did not believe him. Then she nodded, once, silent, and followed him out of the barn. The shack leaned like it was tired of standing. Nathaniel had to duck to enter, and even then he scraped his shoulder on the doorframe. Inside, it was colder than the barn. Zeke lay on a thin blanket by the hearth, his skin pale, lips dry. He whimpered when Adeline knelt beside him, lifting him into her arms with a sound like breaking. Nathaniel crouched beside them, watching quietly. The baby's ribs showed through his shirt. His fingers curled weakly. Adeline looked down at her son, whispering something soft against his temple. She reached into her shawl and cracked one of the eggs into her hand, letting the yolk run into her palm before bringing it to the boy's lips. Zeke sucked feebly. It was enough to make Adeline cry. Nathaniel stood and moved toward the doorway. "Wrap him up." "You are both coming with me. I cannot ask." "You did not ask," he said, turning back to her. "I am offering." She stared up at him, arms wrapped around Zeke, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Why?" He paused. "Because no man should sleep warm while a child starves a mile away." The sun was low by the time they got back to the ranch. Zeke slept against Adeline's chest, wrapped in one of Nathaniel's spare coats. She rode beside him on the wagon bench, too tired to speak. Nathaniel helped her down and led her inside the house. The fireplace was already burning. He set water to boil and took a tin of beans from the shelf. It was not a feast, but it was hot. Adeline ate slowly, careful to share every bite with Zeke, who had started to stir. Nathaniel leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You have family?" She shook her head. "My husband died last winter. Fever took him. We had no one else." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "How long have you been alone out there?" "Since February." "And you made it through the snow?" "Barely." Nathaniel stepped forward and pulled a second chair to the table. He sat across from her. "You are not going back there." Adeline looked up sharply. "I never asked for, I do not care," he said. "That shack will not survive another frost. You and Zeke stay here. As long as you need." She stared at him, lips parted like she was about to argue, but then her shoulders sagged and she nodded once, lips trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Nathaniel just nodded and reached forward, gently brushing a lock of hair from Zeke's forehead. "He is a fighter. Like his mother." Adeline blinked fast, and for the first time since he found her in his barn, she smiled. It was small, tired, but real. Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest. Something quiet. Something sure. He did not say anything else. But he stayed there, watching over them as they ate, until the fire burned low. By the next morning, frost had threaded the windows with pale veins, and the ground outside crunched under Nathaniel's boots as he went to bring in wood. The sun was still climbing when he returned, arms full, to find Adeline in the kitchen. One hip leaned against the counter, sleeves pushed to her elbows as she stirred cornmeal into a pot. Zeke sat in a basket near the hearth, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, watching her with wide eyes. His cheeks were no longer gray. "You got up early," Nathaniel said, setting the wood by the stove. "I heard the rooster." She gave the spoon another slow turn. "Figured I ought to do something useful." He nodded once, not bothering to argue. She didn't seem the type to sit idle. "I found flour in the bin," she added. "Hope you don't mind." "Long as you don't burn it," he said, and she gave him a look flat but not unkind. "I've burned worse things," she said. "Once tried making coffee with creek water and pine needles." "That sounds like a crime." "It tasted like one." Nathaniel leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. The heat from the stove was beginning to thaw the kitchen, and the smell of corn mush cut through the lingering chill. He watched her stir, measured and unhurried. "You were raised out west?" he asked. "No," she scraped the spoon along the pot's edge. "Kentucky. My folks had a tobacco farm. Sold it after the war and moved east. I didn't go with them." He waited. "I married a man headed west. Thought we'd find land in Kansas or maybe Colorado. But he had kin in the territory and we drifted this way instead." She didn't look at him as she spoke. "He got sick before spring came." Nathaniel stepped forward and opened the cupboard above her head. "There's dried apples in here. Might sweeten that." She took the tin he handed her, fingers brushing his. "Thank you." They ate by the fire, Zeke nestled between them on a folded quilt. The boy reached for the spoon with clumsy fingers, and Adeline guided it gently to his mouth. Nathaniel watched, silent, until she looked up. "Is there work to be done today?" she asked. He nodded. "Cattle need checking. Some fences too. I can mend wire. Or clean tack." She glanced toward the back door. "I won't be a burden." "You're not." He stood, brushing crumbs from his shirt. "I'll bring you some stitching. You can sit with Zeke while he rests." She didn't argue, but her shoulders eased slightly. By afternoon, the wind had picked up. Nathaniel worked the far pasture, readying loose wire and hammering posts back into earth hardened by the cold. When he returned near dusk, the windows of the house glowed amber and the smell of stew drifted through the door. Adeline sat at the table, a half-finished harness strap in her lap, her fingers stained with oil. Zeke slept in the crib Nathaniel had hauled down from the loft. "You find everything all right?" he asked, hanging his coat. "I did. That barn's better stocked than most mercantiles I've seen." He poured water into the basin and scrubbed his hands. "I like to be ready." "For what?" "Anything." He dried off, then sat across from her. "Hard winters. Fence breaks. Strangers." She held his gaze. "And what am I?" He didn't flinch. "Someone worth helping." Adeline looked down at her lap, working the strap through her fingers. "You don't know me. I know enough. Enough to see you're not careless. Or cruel. You've carried more than most and you're still standing." She swallowed. "I didn't think anyone saw that." "I do." The room fell quiet, save for the rhythm of Zeke's breathing from the corner. Outside, wind combed through dry grass and the fire crackled softly behind them. Adeline reached for the harness again, but her hands stilled. "My husband's name was Eli. He played the fiddle and he had a temper when he drank. But he loved Zeke. He died holding my hand. Nathaniel said nothing. I don't want pity, she added. You won't get it from me. She looked up. What will I get? He held her gaze. Time. Shelter. A place for you and Zeke. What you do with that is yours to decide. Her eyes glistened, but she nodded, resolute. Then I'll stay. For now. Nathaniel rose and stoked the fire, then pulled the curtain across the window. That's all I ask. He turned back to her, the lines of his face softened by lamplight. You're not alone anymore, Adeline. She didn't speak, but her shoulders lifted with a breath she hadn't known she was holding. For the first time in months, the silence between them felt like comfort, not absence. The next week moved with the quiet rhythm of early autumn days that warmed by noon, nights that pressed cold into the bones. The last of the leaves turned brittle and gold, curling at their edges like old paper. Nathaniel rose before the sun each morning, and Adeline was usually already at the stove when he came in from the yard, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, Zeke crawling clumsily across the floor in search of anything he could mouth. Nathaniel had shifted his routines. Without speaking of it, he made space, mended the latch on the smokehouse, cleared the spare room that had gone untouched since his brother died at Antietam. Zeke's crib fit near the stove where the heat settled in the evenings, and Adeline had begun sewing strips of muslin into diapers, her stitches small and even. That afternoon, Nathaniel brought down a saddle that needed reworking and set it on the porch rail. He was oiling the leather when Adeline stepped outside with a basket of dried laundry, her fingers red from scrubbing. You ever ride? He asked, not looking up. Once, she said. My husband tried to teach me. I stayed on long enough to bruise both knees. He smiled faintly. Well, you've got grit. That counts for more than balance. She lowered the basket to the bench. I'd like to try again. Someday. You will. He wiped his hands and stood. There's a gelding here, gentle as spring rain. I'll saddle him for you when you're ready. Adeline hesitated, then glanced toward the horizon. The land stretched out past the cottonwoods, quiet and open. It still feels strange. Being somewhere safe. Nathaniel didn't answer. He followed her gaze instead, the dusklight catching in the strands of her hair that had slipped loose. I used to think safety was something you had to earn, she went on. Like if you survived hard enough, someone might let you rest. He met her eyes. You don't need to earn it here. She nodded slowly. I'm starting to believe that. Zeke let out a sharp cry from inside, and Adeline turned, already moving. Nathaniel paused in the doorway behind her. He's teething, she said, lifting the child from the floor. I gave him a strip of leather to chew, but he's not much impressed. Nathaniel reached into the cupboard and pulled down a small jar. Try rubbing this on his gums. It's clove and tallow. My ma used it when my sister was cutting teeth. She looked at the jar, then back at him. You had a sister? Had, he said. Caroline. She was 6 when she died. Fever took her in 3 days. Adeline quieted. I'm sorry. He nodded, setting the jar on the table. She liked to sing while she worked. Drove my mother near mad. Zeke fussed again, and Adeline dipped her finger into the salve, pressing it gently along his gums. The boy settled almost immediately. I never had siblings, she said, rocking slightly. Just me and my father after the war. He came back different. Most men did. He drank through most of 67, then left. I haven't seen him since. Nathaniel sat across from her, elbows on his knees. You ever wonder what you'd say to him? She looked down at Zeke, then back at Nathaniel. Nothing. I'd let silence speak for me. He nodded, slow. That's fair. Outside, the wind stirred dry leaves against the stoop. Adeline laid Zeke on his blanket, then turned to the hearth and stirred the pot she'd left warming. There's enough stew for both of us, she said. If you're hungry. I always am, he replied. That night, as they sat at the table, Zeke asleep in the corner, Adeline asked, You ever think about leaving? Leaving where? This place. The ranch. Wyoming. Nathaniel shook his head. No. The land's in my blood. My father homesteaded here after the war, and I buried him under those cottonwoods. I couldn't leave even if I wanted to. She reached for her cup. I imagine there's stories in this house. Plenty. Some worth remembering. Some not. She studied him across the table. You carry them well. He held her gaze. You carry yours like armor. Adeline looked down at her hands. Armor's only good if you know when to lower it. He didn't answer, but the silence that followed was full of something warm. Something beginning. When the fire burned down to coals, Nathaniel stood and filled the kettle one last time. He moved with the same measured calm he always had, but tonight he lingered when he passed her chair. You're doing right by him, he said, nodding toward Zeke. Adeline's eyes softened. I try. You don't have to try alone anymore. A long breath left her chest. I'm starting to believe that too. He gave her a look that held steady and sure, then turned toward the stairs. She watched him go, her heart beating in a way it hadn't in longer than she could name. And for the first time since last winter, she didn't dread the dark. By early October, the sky carried a sharper blue and the mornings arrived with a hush, the kind that made breath visible and boots pause at the threshold. Nathaniel stepped out before sunrise to check the north fence line, the dogs trailing behind him through a silvered mist that clung low to the earth. When he returned near mid-morning, he found Adeline kneeling in the garden rows behind the house, sleeves pushed past her elbows, hands sunk into the soil. You're late, she said without looking up. I almost started thinking you'd fallen in with a badger. Just a broken post. Mule got clever and leaned on it till it gave. She pulled a carrot from the ground, brushed it off on her skirt. Your mule's smarter than most men I've met. Nathaniel crouched beside her, brushing dirt from a potato root. That's not a high bar. She gave a soft laugh, brief and low in her throat, and he glanced at her sideways. Her hair was braided today, thicker than he'd realized, a few strands sticking to her temple from the work. Zeke sat nearby in a wooden crate lined with wool, gnawing on a spoon, babbling to the crows overhead. I didn't expect the soil out here to yield much, she said. But it's deeper than I thought. It'll give if you treat it right. Keep the rocks out, turn it before the frost. She sat back on her heels. Like people, then? Nathaniel nodded once. Exactly like. They worked in silence for a while, the kind that moved easy between two people not forcing it. When the basket was full, Nathaniel took it into the root cellar, and Adeline lifted Zeke to her hip and followed. Inside, the air was cool and still. She watched as Nathaniel arranged the vegetables in wide bins, his movements practiced, efficient. You ever think about what comes after all this? She asked. He looked up. After what? After the work. After the years pass. She shifted Zeke to her other arm. Do you picture anything different? Nathaniel leaned against the cellar wall, wiping his hands on a cloth. Used to. Not lately. Why not? He hesitated, then spoke. Hard to plan for something you've never seen. My folks didn't live long enough to grow old. My brother never even started a family. I figured this land would be mine till I was dust, and that'd be that. Adeline looked at him, brow furrowed. That's a lonely thought. He met her eyes. It was. She didn't look away. And now? Nathaniel took a slow breath. Now it's different. She didn't press. Just nodded and stepped carefully up the ladder, Zeke curled against her shoulder. Nathaniel followed, and they emerged into the late morning light. Later that day, while Zeke napped in the shade of the porch, Adeline stood in the barn doorway with a length of blue cotton in her hands. Nathaniel was brushing down one of the horses, the rhythm of it steady as breath. I found a pattern in the chest upstairs, she said. Someone started a quilt and never finished. That'd be my ma. She'd cut squares in the winter, so when the wind howled. Never pieced it all together, though. I could finish it. She ran the fabric between her fingers. If it's all right. He nodded. You'd be doing her proud. She stepped into the barn, the light falling in stripes across the floor. Did she teach you anything? About sewing. I mean, only that thimbles are worth more than pride when the needle bites. Adeline smiled faintly. Sounds like good advice. Nathaniel set the brush aside and leaned against the stall gate. She used to say a quilt tells you who someone is. The scraps come from lives lived out loud, shirts worn thin, curtains sun-faded, dresses torn at the hem. Adeline held the fabric up to the light. Then it's a story, isn't it? Just in pieces. He nodded. A quiet one. They stood there a moment, the dust rising in the sunbeams, the gentle creak of the rafters above them. Zeke stirred on the porch, let out a drowsy sigh, then settled again. Adeline looked to the loft ladder. There's a trunk up there that smells like cedar. I think I'll bring it down, see what else she left behind. Nathaniel stepped aside. You're welcome to it. As she moved toward the ladder, she paused and looked back at him. You know, you don't speak much about what you want. He tilted his head. Haven't had much reason to. Well, she said, voice quieter, you do now. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He watched her ascend the ladder, the fabric tucked beneath her arm. Then he turned back to the horse, brushing slow, the echo of her words settling deep as roots. Out on the porch, Zeke slept on, the wind soft through the grass, and the sun warm on the planks. The day stretched forward, quiet and full, and nothing in Nathaniel's world felt like it used to. The first snow came early that year, soft and dry, brushing the rooftops and fencing like powdered chalk. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the field beside the barn, watching the flakes drift through the morning air. Behind him, the house was quiet save for the low clatter of Adeline's treadle sewing machine, an old one, rusted in places, that he'd found boxed in oilcloth in the cellar. He hadn't known it still worked until she'd cleaned and coaxed it back to life, stitching the first lines of a quilt beneath the amber glow of a kerosene lamp. She'd shown him a square last night cut from an old Sunday dress she said she never liked wearing but hadn't been able to throw out. He hadn't said much, but he'd run his hand across the stitches and felt something settle deep in his chest. He walked back inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. Adeline looked up from the table where she was cutting more cloth. You'll track in half the prairie, she said, though her tone held no edge. Nathaniel toed off his boots near the door. Storm's not far off. Wind's coming from the east. I'll bring in more wood, she said, setting the scissors aside. I already did. It's stacked near the stove. She paused, then gave him a long look. You always think 2 steps ahead? Only when I've got something to lose. She didn't speak, but her eyes softened and she turned back to her sewing. Zeke sat at her feet on a folded wool rug, tapping a wooden spoon against a pan. He'd grown more curious lately, crawling across the floor with purpose, pulling himself upright on the furniture. Nathaniel crouched beside him. You'll be walking by spring, he said. Won't be a thing in this house safe after that. Adeline smiled faintly. I hope he's stubborn. It'll keep him alive. Nathaniel looked up at her, then rose. You've been quiet since yesterday. I've been thinking. About? She set her scissors down again, slower this time, and turned to face him. I want to stay. He didn't move. You already are. I mean proper. Not just passing time until winter breaks. Her voice was even, but there was something behind it, something steady. I want to build a life here. If that's still something you can see. Nathaniel stepped closer, hands loose at his sides. I see it clearer every day. I know what you don't expect, he interrupted gently. But I've been watching what you do. You've made this place full again. And I've never met a woman who could turn a bare room into a home with nothing but her hands and a little thread. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with something quieter. I've never been given the chance to stay put. You have it now. She looked at him a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. Then let's stop pretending we're waiting for something else. He gripped her fingers, rough against rough. You and Zeke belong here. I want it said plain. It's plain, she said. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Nathaniel moved to the hearth and added another log, stirring the embers to life. Adeline sat beside him on the floor, Zeke now curled in her lap, thumb in his mouth. I don't need a preacher's blessing, she said after a moment, but I'd say vows if you asked. I'll ask, he said. And I'll mean every word. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That's enough for me. They sat that way until the fire burned full again and the room glowed warm as bread crust. Outside, the snow fell thicker now, but inside, the stillness was something whole. The following week, Nathaniel rode into town with Zeke bundled in a sling beneath his coat and came back with a ring, a simple band, nothing fancy, but he'd traded 2 calves and a sack of feed for it, and the moment he slid it onto Adeline's finger by the fire, he knew it was worth more than anything else on the land. They married quietly in the parlor, just the 3 of them, with the wind rattling the windows and the baby asleep in the cradle Nathaniel had carved from pine. No guests, no paper. Just a promise spoken low and sure, and a kiss that lingered longer than any before. That spring, Zeke took his first steps between them, his arms stretched wide, the quilt Adeline had finished draped across the rocking chair. Nathaniel planted rows of beans and cabbage in the garden she'd turned rich, and they built a new henhouse together, laughing when the nails bent sideways and her apron caught on the fence. By summer, she'd started teaching Zeke how to count by sorting seeds into jars. Nathaniel built him a stool to reach the table. They ate together every evening, hands clasped before the meal, the quiet not empty but full. In time, they added to the house a porch swing, another room, a patch of wildflowers that came back each year without fail. They never spoke of the shack in the woods again. Nathaniel never took a day for granted. Not the way Adeline hummed as she kneaded dough, nor the way Zeke reached for his hand as they walked the pasture. And Adeline never stopped looking at him like he was the first man to see her whole. They grew old with the land, not apart from it. And when the snow returned each year, they lit the fire early, quilt across their laps, the past behind them and the future tucked warm between their palms.